We start off today talking about something that made headlines and I think is confusing a lot of people and exciting some of those in kind of the anti-vax, anti-mask world. And what it was a review that was done by Cochrane of a bunch of or multiple studies looking at the efficacy of masks. And one of the authors, when asked about the conclusion that was drawn from this or kind of his summary, had a very explicit phrase that seemed to clearly indicate everything's been answered. Masks don't work 100%. Okay. They don't work. It's been answered. This Cochrane review has given us that answer. And so I want to walk through why that conclusion's flawed, and actually what we can and can't take from this review. And it'll be a good chance as well, separate from just the specifics of this, to talk about how do we approach scientific information? How do we approach analysis like this so that we can understand what the best way to gain insight is and what insight can be gained from different batches of research and different batches of information. And it actually is going through the awesome, wonderful scientific process, not as I see some people indicating that this is a rejection of the science, if that makes sense. And this is really important because, like I said, a lot of people are confused about what should be taken away from this Cochrane review, what was looked at with this review, and that is bad because a lot of people now believe things and they believe the science supports the things that they believe that aren't fully accurate. So with that being said, here's this review done by Cochrane, like I said, looking at multiple studies. I think it was 78 different batches of research, looking at the efficacy of masks for influenza and COVID-19. And the types of headlines that you saw and the types of articles that came out were as follows from the New York Times. This is an op-ed. The most rigorous and comprehensive analysis of scientific studies conducted on the efficacy of masks for reducing the spread of respiratory illnesses, including COVID-19, was published late last month. Its conclusions, said Tom Jefferson, the Oxford epidemiologist who is its lead author, were unambiguous. Quote, "There's just no evidence that they," meaning masks, "make any difference," he told the journalist Marianne DeMazzi, full stop. So that seemed clear, right? Whoa. One of the authors of this review said, full stop, they don't work. So why wouldn't that now be our conclusion? Well, as I was walking through the details, and this is part of what we'll talk about a little bit more, why it's important to understand what these types of analyses look like, what the methodology is, and gain information from observing those details yourself. But here from The Guardian, they nicely summarize what I was noticing when diving into these details. The analysis is flawed because it compares apples to oranges. The paper mixes together studies that were conducted in different environments with different transmission risks. It also combines studies where masks were worn part of the time with studies where masks are worn all of the time. And it blends studies that looked at COVID-19 with studies that looked at influenza. If apples work and oranges don't, but your analysis mixes them together, you may come to the false conclusion that apples don't work. Out of the 78 papers analyzed in the review, only two actually study masking during the COVID-19 pandemic. And both of those found that masks did protect wearers from COVID-19. But these studies are drowned out by the greater number of studies on influenza included, where the benefit of masking is hard to detect because it's a far less contagious virus than COVID-19. So when looking at studies in all these different environments and weighing influenza masking efficacy and COVID-19 masking efficacy and weighing a bunch of information about influenza masking, and when you dive into the specifics of some of those studies, even the methodology there was deeply flawed. And I say that not meaning that there was anything wrong going on. All these studies are valuable, but you want to know what they're saying. And even within, as we'll get to in a second here, these batches of research, the researchers recognize where the gaps are, what they are proving, what they're not proving, what they're trying to answer, what they're not. And then people take the wrong conclusions from that, and it's really upsetting to watch. But I understand why there's confusion. You saw that quote. It seemed pretty undeniable. And so here, when you weigh a bunch of information on influenza and flawed studies on even that, with a couple or a few effective examples with COVID-19 specifically, and then the answer becomes masking is not effective for anything, including COVID-19, you are very much misleading people. And again, I'm not saying the researchers. It's the way that that information has been synthesized that has caused the confusion. And as I noted here from The Guardian, even the authors themselves acknowledge in the paper the high risk of bias in the trials, variation in outcome measurement, and relatively low adherence with the interventions during the studies hampers drawing firm conclusions. So this brings us, number one, to a clear understanding we should have that while this review was very valuable and interesting and something that should be focused on because it did look at a lot of studies and there is valuable information to be gathered from that, the answer is not then masking doesn't work for COVID-19, because that's not even what this study spent all of its time looking into. And the studies that were, or this review of studies, the studies that were included within this review that did look at COVID-19 masking did prove it to be effective. And so you see where the confusion is coming from, but that brings us to how we should approach these things. Because I think what ends up happening, and I've noticed this in my personal life when I talk with people and they hear one thing from me, one thing from someone else, and the question is often, okay, if credible sources over here are saying this and credible sources over here are saying this, how do I know what's true and what's not? And it's a more complex answer than just this, but simply it's about understanding the process of gathering information that then leads people to explain conclusions, okay? And often, if you just listen to public health officials, you're going to get nicely synthesized conclusions based on the information that they gathered. But you also can walk through the information that they gathered and make sure the conclusion makes sense. Because sometimes either through kind of the telephone game or through misarticulations of what was looked into, what was and wasn't a part of the research, there can be a huge misunderstanding that no one's to blame for. It's just kind of, like I said, the telephone game and a misunderstanding about the limitations of particular research and what particular analyses are addressing or what particular studies are addressing. And so what's important, and I wish we did this better in K through 12 education, is for people to understand how studies are done or how different batches of research are done and the methodology, the processes that go into that. And so that you yourself can look into it and go, okay, for example, when looking at this review, you can go and look, as I was doing, at the particular studies and what their methodology was, what their process was, and they'll explain, this is what we aren't able to address, this is what we were able to address, here's the limitations, here's where things could have gotten murky, and understand, okay, then putting those together, here's what we can and can't say about what this means. And that, I don't think, is something that's being done and is able to be done with the mass media format that often communicates the information that comes from scientific research, which is really unfortunate because there is nuance. And in the case of this, it's very fascinating to look at what was reviewed, but based on the focusing on multiple subjects, multiple types of studies, and then smooshing it together into one conclusion that then was recommunicated by a lot of media outlets, has caused a situation that's deeply, deeply unfortunate, but reminds us what the process is that we should be going through when looking at this type of information.